I adjusted my tie for the third time. My fingers trembled as I stood alone in the first pew, staring at the closed casket. The funeral home was quiet. Too quiet. I glanced at my watch. The service was supposed to start 10 minutes ago. Margaret's friends filled half the chapel. Her book club, her volunteer group from the food bank. Even Mrs. Chen from down the street, who could barely walk these days, had made it. But the front row, where our sons should have been sitting, remained empty. I pulled out my phone. No messages. I'd called each of them twice this morning. The calls went straight to voicemail. Mr. Harrison. The funeral director approached with careful steps. Should we wait a few more minutes? I shook my head. No. Let's begin. Margaret would have understood. She always understood more than I gave her credit for. The service was beautiful. People spoke about my wife's kindness, her dedication to the community, her infectious laugh. I tried to focus on their words, but my mind kept wandering to the empty seats beside me. Where were James, Robert, and Thomas? Afterward, as I stood by the casket one last time, my phone buzzed. James. Dad, I'm so sorry. The Tokyo merger meeting couldn't be rescheduled. You know how it is. Robert. I feel terrible. This board presentation was scheduled months ago. I'll make it up to you. Thomas. Stuck in Miami. Flight canceled due to weather. We'll try to get back tomorrow. I stared at the messages. Tokyo. Miami. Board presentations. Our family home was in Vancouver. James lived in Seattle, a 2-hour drive. Robert was in Calgary, a 90-minute flight. Thomas was supposedly in Toronto for work. But Miami? Margaret had died 3 days ago. 3 days. More than enough time to clear any schedule. You knew, I whispered to the casket. You knew they wouldn't come. 6 weeks earlier, Margaret had collapsed in our kitchen. Stroke. By the time I got her to the hospital, the doctors said there was nothing they could do. She had maybe 3 months, if we were lucky. She lasted 6 weeks. But during those 6 weeks, something happened that I didn't understand until later. Margaret became secretive. She had long phone calls with Harold, our family lawyer, always closing the door to her study. When I asked about it, she'd smile and say, "Just updating our will, dear. At our age, we should have everything in order." I thought she was being practical. Margaret was always practical. Our sons visited twice during those 6 weeks, once each. James came first, stayed for 2 hours. He spent 45 minutes on his phone, 20 minutes eating the lunch I made, and 15 minutes at his mother's bedside. The rest of the time he paced the living room, checking his watch. "Mom understands," he said as he left. "The company needs me. This Yamamoto deal is worth $200 million. Robert's visit was worse. He brought his wife, Vanessa, who spent the entire time photographing our antiques and asking about their value. "Just curious," she'd said, when I caught her examining the maker's mark on Margaret's grandmother's china. Thomas didn't even pretend. He showed up, stayed 40 minutes, and left with our spare key. "In case I need to check on things," he'd said. I found out later from the neighbor that he'd been back twice, alone, going through the house. Margaret saw it all. She didn't say anything, but I could see it in her eyes. The sadness, the disappointment, the resignation. "They're just worried," I'd told her one night as I held her hand. "This is hard for them." She'd squeezed my fingers weakly. "David, you've always seen the best in them. That's why I love you. But sometimes love means opening your eyes." I didn't want to open my eyes. These were my sons. I'd raised them. I'd worked 60-hour weeks to send them to the best schools. Margaret had sacrificed her career as a teacher to be home with them. We'd given them everything. "They'll come around," I'd insisted. "When they have their own children, they'll understand." Margaret had just smiled. That sad, knowing smile. The day before she died, she was barely conscious. I sat beside her hospital bed, holding her hand. She opened her eyes briefly and whispered, "Harold has everything. Trust him, David. And trust me. I've made sure the boys learn what they need to learn." "What do you mean?" I'd asked. But she'd already slipped back into unconsciousness. She died the next morning while I was getting coffee. I'd stepped away for 10 minutes, just 10 minutes. And she died alone. Just like she was buried alone, her sons too busy with deals and presentations and mysterious trips to Miami. The day after the funeral, I sat in Harold's office. He was Margaret's age, 67, with kind eyes and careful hands that adjusted his glasses frequently. "David, I need to prepare you," he said. Margaret's instructions were very specific and unusual. Just tell me what she wanted. Harold opened a folder. She revised her will 6 weeks ago. Everything was changed. Changed how? The house, the investments, her trust fund, everything is divided equally among James, Robert, and Thomas. But there are conditions. What kind of conditions? Each son must spend 30 consecutive nights in the family home. No hotels, no leaving except for work. They must stay together. I stared at him. Why? That's not all. Harold pulled out a wooden box. Margaret left 30 letters, one for each night. The sons must read them together, aloud, each evening at 7 p.m. In the living room, all three present, and if they don't, then the entire estate goes to charity. The Vancouver Food Bank, the literacy center where Margaret volunteered, and the women's shelter. Everything, everything. The house is worth $3 million. Margaret's trust fund and investments total another $4 million. Combined with your joint accounts and assets, we're talking about $8 million. I leaned back. $8 million. Margaret had been modest about her family money. I'd known she had some, but $8 million? When do they need to do this? They have 60 days to begin. Once they start, they must complete all 30 days consecutively. If anyone leaves early, if anyone misses even one letter reading, everything goes to charity. She wanted to teach them something. Yes. Harold's expression softened. And David, you're not required to participate. Margaret left you separate provisions. The house in Whistler, your pension, and $2 million. You're taken care of regardless of what the boys do. She protected me. She loved you. But she also wanted you to see what she'd seen. This wasn't just about the boys, David. This was about opening your eyes. I called the boys that evening. This time, they all answered. "Dad, I've got 5 minutes," James said. "What's up?" "Your mother's will was read today." Silence. Then, "And? You need to come home. All three of you. Harold can explain the details. Can't you just tell me?" "No. You need to hear it from him. All three of you. Together." Robert was more direct. "How much are we getting? Come home and find out." Thomas tried bargaining. "I'm in the middle of something big. Can this wait until next month?" "No. Your mother's will stipulates you have 60 days. The clock started today." That got their attention. 3 days later, I stood in Harold's office as my 3 sons walked in. I barely recognized them. James had gained weight, his expensive suit pulling tight across his middle. Robert looked exhausted, dark circles under his eyes. Thomas wore a designer tracksuit that probably cost more than my first car. "Dad," James nodded. He didn't hug me. None of them did. Harold got straight to business. He explained Margaret's will, the money, the house, the 30 nights, the 30 letters. James was the first to speak. "This is ridiculous. I run a multinational corporation. I can't just drop everything for a month." "Then you forfeit your share," Harold said calmly. "It's emotional manipulation," Robert added. "Mom was sick. This will could be challenged. It was notarized, witnessed by 3 independent parties, and written while your mother was in perfect mental health. 6 weeks before her death." Harold's voice was steady. "Challenge it if you wish. But I guarantee you'll lose, and it will cost you more in legal fees than you'd inherit." Thomas was on his phone. "What if we just, I don't know, do it quickly? Like speed through the letters?" "The letters are sealed by date. Each envelope has a tamper-proof seal. They can only be opened on the designated night, at the designated time. I'll be present to verify compliance." "You?" James looked offended. "This is ridiculous." "These were your mother's wishes." Harold's voice had an edge now. "She spent considerable time planning this. The least you can do is respect that." "Did she say why?" Robert asked. "Why put us through this?" Harold looked at me. I realized Margaret had shared something with him, something she hadn't told me. Your mother felt, Harold said carefully, that you'd lost sight of what matters. She wanted to remind you. By bribing us? Thomas snorted. By making us jump through hoops for money that should be ours anyway? Actually, I said quietly, and all three turned to me. None of this was yours anyway. It was your mother's. She earned it. Her family's trust. Her inheritance. She could have given it all to charity without this. Instead, she's giving you a chance. A chance to what? James demanded. To remember who she was. Who you used to be. The silence that followed was heavy. Finally, Robert sighed. When do we start? The first night is next Monday, Harold said. That gives you 5 days to arrange your schedules. They left without saying goodbye to me. As the door closed, I turned to Harold. What was in that first letter? I don't know. Margaret sealed them herself. But she told me. He hesitated. She told me the first one would make them want to leave. That was the test. Monday came. I stayed in Whistler, at the cabin that was now solely mine. Margaret and I had bought it 20 years ago, planning to retire there together. Now I was here alone, wondering what was happening in our Vancouver home. Harold called me that evening at 7:15. They're all here, he said, barely on time. Thomas tried to claim he was sick. James had his assistant call to reschedule. Robert showed up 40 minutes late. But they're here. And the letter? We're opening it now. I heard voices in the background. Then, silence. Long, heavy silence. Harold? I said. What's happening? The letter, he said quietly. David, you should come back. Tonight. I drove the 2 hours from Whistler in a daze. When I arrived at our home, the lights were all on. Through the front window, I could see my 3 sons sitting in the living room. None of them were talking. They just sat there, staring at nothing. I walked in. Harold was in the kitchen, making tea. What did it say? I asked. He handed me a piece of paper. Margaret's handwriting. Elegant. Clear. My dear sons, by now you know the conditions of my will. 30 nights, 30 letters. I imagine you're angry. You probably think this is cruel or manipulative. Maybe you're already planning how to contest this. Before you do, I want you to know something. I forgive you. I forgive you for not coming to my funeral. Yes, I knew you wouldn't come. I've known for years that your father and I had become obligations rather than family, that your visits were duty calls, timed and scheduled like business meetings. I forgive you, James, for spending your last visit with me on your phone, for checking your watch every 5 minutes, for lying and saying you'd visit again next week when we both knew you wouldn't. I forgive you, Robert, for bringing your wife to appraise my belongings while I lay dying upstairs. Yes, I knew. Mrs. Chen saw her photographing the silverware. Did you really think I wouldn't hear about that? And Thomas, sweet Thomas, I forgive you for taking our spare key and going through our things, for opening my jewelry box, for checking the labels on the paintings. I know you thought I was too far gone to notice, but I wasn't. Not yet. I forgive all of this. But forgiveness doesn't mean I'm going to enable it to continue. Your father doesn't know what I know. He doesn't know about the loans you've taken, James, using the company you were supposed to be running successfully. He doesn't know that company is $30 million in debt, and you've been betting on this inheritance to save it. He doesn't know, Robert, that you've remortgaged your house 3 times, that Vanessa's shopping addiction has bankrupted you, that you're 2 months behind on your country club dues and facing foreclosure. And David certainly doesn't know, Thomas, that you've never had a real job, that the tech startup you told us about was a lie, that you've been living off credit cards and the allowance your father still sends you every month, even though you're 38 years old. I found all of this out during my last 6 weeks. It's amazing what a dying woman with a good internet connection can discover. I also hired a private investigator, worth every penny. So yes, you need this money, desperately. That's the only reason you're sitting there right now, reading this letter. But here's what you need to know. You're going to earn it, not through work or deals or presentations. You're going to earn it by facing the truth about yourselves, about what you've become, about what you've done to this family. Each letter will reveal something. Some things you know, some things you don't. but all of it is true. You can leave any time. The door is open. But if you do, you leave with nothing but what you came with. Debt, lies, and the memory of a mother whose funeral you skipped. Or you can stay, read the letters, face the truth, and maybe, just maybe, find your way back to the men I raised you to be. The choice, as always, is yours. I love you. I always will. But love without truth is just enabling. Your mother, I read it twice. Then I looked up at Harold. She knew everything. She spent her last weeks making sure of it. She wanted to give them a chance, David, but she wanted it to be a real chance, built on truth. I walked into the living room. James was the first to look up. His face was red. You didn't know about this? No. She hired a private investigator. Robert's voice cracked. Our own mother spied on us. Or, I said quietly, your mother loved you enough to find out the truth. Thomas stood up. I'm not staying for this. This is insane. Then go, I said. But don't come back. Not for money. Not for guilt. Not ever. If you walk out that door now, you're done. With all of this, he stared at me. I'd never spoken to him like that before. Margaret had always been the disciplinarian. I was the soft touch, the one who believed the best in them. Your mother gave you a gift, I continued. She could have just cut you off. Instead, she's offering you 30 nights to figure out where you went wrong. 30 chances to choose differently. That's more than most people get. And if we stay? James asked. What? We sit here and read letters about what terrible people we are? You read letters about the truth. What you do with that truth is up to you. They stayed that night. But the tension in the house was unbearable. I'd planned to go back to Whistler, but I couldn't leave. These were still my sons, even if I barely recognized them anymore. The second letter was shorter. It was about James's 10th birthday, how he'd spent the entire day helping Margaret bake cupcakes for his class, insisting they make enough for everyone, including the kids who never brought treats. How proud she'd been of his kindness. What happened to that boy? The letter ended. James didn't answer. He just stood up and went to his old room. The third letter was about Robert's graduation from law school. How hard he'd worked. How he'd helped classmates study even when he was struggling himself. How Margaret had known he'd become a good lawyer because he genuinely wanted to help people. When did helping people stop mattering? She'd written. Robert's hands shook as he folded the letter. The fourth letter was about Thomas. About how he'd spent every Saturday volunteering at the animal shelter when he was 16. How gentle he'd been with the scared dogs. How Margaret had believed he'd become a veterinarian. Where did that compassion go? She'd asked. By the fifth night, they'd stopped pretending to check their phones constantly. By the seventh night, they were actually talking to each other, not just sitting in silence. By the 10th night, something shifted. The 10th letter was different. It wasn't about memories. It was about Margaret's cancer diagnosis 5 years ago. Cancer she'd beaten with surgery and treatment. Cancer she'd never told any of them about. Why didn't I tell you? She'd written. Because I knew you wouldn't come. Or worse, you'd come out of obligation and resent me for it. I didn't want that. I wanted to deal with it privately. With your father, who held my hand through every treatment. But I want you to think about what it meant. That I couldn't trust my own sons to be there for me when I needed them. That I had to hide my cancer because I knew it would be an inconvenience to you. Think about that. James broke first. He'd been reading the letter aloud, but he stopped halfway through, his voice cracking. Robert took over. When he finished, Thomas was crying. We didn't know, James whispered. Because she couldn't tell us, Robert said. Because we'd become the kind of people your mother can't tell about cancer. That night, I sat with them, really sat with them, for the first time in years. James told me about the company, about how he'd overextended trying to impress a board that didn't care about him, about how he'd confused success with significance. Robert admitted that Vanessa had a problem, that he'd enabled it because it was easier than confronting it, that he'd lost himself trying to maintain an image of wealth they didn't actually have. Thomas confessed everything, the lies, the fake job, the money I'd been sending him that he'd used for nothing productive, I was ashamed, he said, and the more ashamed I got, the more I lied, and then I couldn't find my way back. But you can now, I said. That's what your mother is giving you. A way back. The letters continued. Some were harsh. Some were gentle. Some were funny, reminding them of moments they'd forgotten. Margaret had structured them carefully, Harold told me later. Hard truths balanced with loving memories. Criticism paired with encouragement. By the 20th night, something remarkable had happened. My sons were cooking dinner together, cleaning the house, taking walks, actually talking about real things, not just about money or deals or status. The 20th letter explained Margaret's will structure, why she'd done it this way. I could have just given you the money, but money without wisdom is just fuel for destruction. I could have cut you off entirely, but that would have been giving up on you, and I never gave up on my sons. So I'm giving you 30 days. 30 days to remember, 30 days to reflect, 30 days to choose who you want to be, because that's what this is really about. Choice. You chose to skip my funeral. You chose to see me as an inconvenience. You chose money over family. Now you get to choose again. Every day for 30 days. Who are you going to be? The 25th letter was about my father, Margaret's father-in-law, who died when the boys were young. How he'd built a small business from nothing. How he'd lost it all in a recession, but never lost his integrity. Grandpa Joe died with almost nothing, Margaret wrote. But at his funeral, 200 people came. People whose lives he'd touched. People he'd helped when he couldn't afford to help himself. At my funeral, 40 people came. None of them were my sons. Which funeral matters more? The one with 200 people who barely knew him but respected him? Or the one that should have had 3 men who loved me but couldn't be bothered? Your grandfather used to say, "You can measure a person's wealth by how many people show up when there's nothing left to gain." By that measure, I died rich. But by that same measure, what are you? On the 30th night, I came back to the house. Harold was there. My 3 sons sat together on the couch, the way they used to when they were boys watching movies. Harold opened the final envelope. Margaret's face looked back at us from a photograph paper-clipped to the letter. She was smiling. It was from our 40th anniversary, just a year ago. The letter was addressed to all of us. My darling David, if you're reading this, then our sons have made it through all 30 nights. I'm so proud of them, and I'm so sorry for keeping this from you. You always wanted to believe the best in them. I love that about you. But sometimes love means doing hard things. I made you watch them struggle through this. I made you see what they'd become, not to hurt you, but because you needed to see it. You can't help them change if you don't acknowledge there's a problem. James, Robert, Thomas, you've spent 30 days facing hard truths. You've read about the boys you were and the men you became. Now comes the hardest part, deciding what happens next. The money is yours, all of it. No more conditions. You fulfilled the terms of the will. But before you take it, I want you to do one thing. I want you to decide what you actually need it for. James, your company is failing. You can use your inheritance to save it, or you can let it fail and start something new, something that matters to you. Not just to a board of directors who will replace you the minute you stop being useful. Robert, you can pay off your debts, but if you do, what changes? Will Vanessa get help? Will you keep chasing an image of success that's bankrupting you emotionally and financially? Or will you use this as a chance to build something real? Thomas, you can use this money to continue drifting. Or you can finally figure out who you want to be. You're 38. It's not too late. But it's also not getting any earlier. I'm not telling you what to do. I'm asking you to choose consciously. To think about what matters. To remember that money is a tool, not a purpose. And I'm asking you to take care of your father. He's been taking care of all of us for so long. He's the one who stayed by my bed every night in the hospital, who held my hand when I was scared, who loved me without condition even when I didn't deserve it. Don't make him spend his final years alone, wondering if he failed as a father. He didn't. I did. I saw what was happening and I let it continue because I didn't want to upset you. That was my failure, not his. So love him. Actually love him, not with cards at Christmas and phone calls on birthdays. Love him with your time, your presence, your truth. That's my real will. Not the money, not the house. This. Love each other. Be there for each other. Choose family over deals, over status, over whatever temporary thing seems important this week. Because in the end, at every end, the only thing that matters is who showed up. I love you all. Margaret. The room was silent except for the sound of my 3 sons crying. Grown men, all of them, sobbing like children. James was the first to speak. I don't want the money. What? Robert looked at him. I don't want it. Or, I want to use it differently. James wiped his eyes. The company can fail. Mom was right. It wasn't mine anyway. It was Dad's dream for me, but it was never my dream. I want to teach. Business ethics. I want to help people build companies that matter, not just companies that make money. I want to be a public defender, Robert said quietly. That's what I went to law school for. Before Vanessa. Before the big house and the country club. I wanted to help people who couldn't afford lawyers. I can do that now. And Vanessa, he paused. Vanessa needs help that I can't give her. Professional help. If she won't get it, then maybe we're not right for each other. Thomas was quiet for a long time. Then he said, I want to finish the degree I dropped out of. Environmental science. I want to work for Parks Canada. I want to do something that matters. I looked at my sons. Really looked at them. And for the first time in years, I saw the boys I'd raised. Not the men they'd become, but the men they could still be. Your mother would be proud, I said. What about you, Dad? James asked. Are you proud? I thought about that. About the years of disappointment I'd been avoiding, about the funeral with the empty seats, about Margaret dying with secrets because she couldn't trust her own sons. But I also thought about these 30 nights, about the choice they'd made to stay, about the tears they were crying now, real tears, not the performance tears of obligation. Yes, I said finally. I'm proud, not of who you were, but of who you're choosing to be. Harold cleared his throat. There's one more thing. Margaret left instructions with me. If you made it through all 30 nights, I was to give you this. He pulled out another envelope. Inside was a check, $1 million, made out to the Vancouver Food Bank. She wants you to deliver it together, Harold said, to see where your inheritance could have gone, to understand what wealth really means. 2 weeks later, the 4 of us stood in the food bank where Margaret had volunteered for 15 years. The director, a woman named Ruth, accepted the check with tears in her eyes. Margaret talked about you boys all the time, Ruth said. She was so proud of who you'd been, and she had such hope for who you'd become. Did she tell you about the will? Robert asked. She told me everything. She asked my advice, actually, about whether she was being too harsh. Ruth smiled. I told her that love isn't always gentle. Sometimes it has to be fierce. She was being fierce because she loved you. We toured the facility, saw where Margaret had worked every Wednesday for 15 years, saw the food she'd organized, the families she'd helped, the program she'd started to teach cooking classes to people learning to feed their families on a tight budget. She never told us about this, Thomas said. She tried, Ruth said gently. She invited you to volunteer with her, multiple times. But you were always too busy. That night, we sat in the house one more time. James was moving his stuff out the next day, heading back to Seattle to close his company properly and apply for teaching positions. Robert was meeting with divorce lawyers and therapist referrals. Thomas was enrolling in online classes to finish his degree. What are you going to do, Dad? Thomas asked. Live, I said simply. Your mother and I had plans. Travel we never did because we were waiting for the right time. I'm going to do those things. And I'm going to volunteer at the food bank on Wednesdays. Someone needs to continue her work. Can we come? James asked. Sometimes, when we're in town, I'd like that. 6 months later, I stood at Margaret's grave. It was her birthday. I brought flowers, her favorite, white roses. You were right, I told her. About all of it. They needed the truth. I needed to see the truth. And you gave us all a gift, even if it didn't feel like it at the time. I heard footsteps behind me, all three of my sons arriving together. They'd driven up from Seattle, Calgary, and Toronto. Not for an inheritance, not for obligation, but because it was their mother's birthday, and they wanted to be here. James had left his phone in the car. Robert wore jeans and a simple jacket, not his usual designer suit. Thomas carried a handmade card, something he'd created himself. We stood together at her grave. A family, not perfect, not healed, but healing. Together. "Thanks, Mom," James said quietly, "for not giving up on us. For being fierce," Robert added. "For loving us enough to make us face the truth," Thomas finished. I put my arm around Thomas's shoulders, then James's, then Robert's, my son's. Home at last. Margaret had written in her final letter that the only thing that mattered was who showed up. Today, we all showed up. Not because we had to, but because we chose to. And that, I realized, was what she'd wanted all along. Not compliance, not obligation, but choice. The conscious decision to be present, to be family, to matter to each other. "She's smiling," I said. "Wherever she is, she's smiling." "How do you know?" Thomas asked. "Because she got what she wanted. All of us, together, by choice. That was always her dream." We stood there for a long time. 4 men united by loss and love, and the fierce grace of a woman who refused to let us fail ourselves. The inheritance wasn't the money. It was never the money. The inheritance was this moment, this choice, this family, broken and mended, learning to show up for each other. That was worth more than $8 million could ever be.